Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope you and your families are safe. We know that we are very concerned about all our friends in Israel. So we thank you very much for making the time to join us today for our second session with Paul Fergaz. Again, I want to formally welcome you to our second session of Christians and Jews from Conflict to Coexistence. We are excited to have you join us today as we continue this journey. Over the course of 4 sessions, as you know, we'll dive deep into the history of Jewish-Christian relations, witnessing the transformation from conflict to coexistence. As always, it's crucial to recall that this relationship didn't always have a sense of unity. Throughout the centuries, anti-Judaism, driven by the belief in that Jews are responsible for Christ's death, loomed over it. The Holocaust served as a catalyst for the church to initiate its journey towards reconciliation with the Jewish community. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I am Ellen Resnick, the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. At CWB, we provide immersive professional development for educators, offering unique travel and virtual learning experiences enriched with academic rigor and valuable resources. We are very grateful for your support over this past decade. In the past 3 years alone, we've hosted over 458 virtual programs, engaging nearly 76,000 participants from around the world. If you'd like to make a donation, I will drop the link into the chat for you right now to support our mission. I now have the pleasure of introducing today's scholar, Paul Fergaz. For more than a decade, Paul was the principal of the secondary campus at Mount Scopius College, a large K-12 Jewish day school in Melbourne, Australia. He has also lectured in Bible and Jewish history at Monash University, Australian Center for Jewish Civilization, and taught about Jewish education as well as school leadership in the university's Faculty of Education. Since 2010, Paul has curated and led Jewish study tours of various European destinations under the auspices of the Jewish Museum of Australia. For most of his professional life, Paul has been actively engaged and involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue, and he also works closely with teachers in the Catholic education sector. Please, along today's lecture, if you have any questions, drop them to me, Ellen Resnick, in the chat. We will stop the presentation at various times to field those questions. And with that, Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. I'm going to go straight into my screen share and we will get underway. So my first slide here is simply to locate us back into last week's session. And basically what we looked at, pretty much the whole of the session was devoted to what I refer to as the literature of Adversos Judaeos. Adversos Judaeos, if you cast your mind back to last week, was also the title of one of the works of the Church Fathers, John Chrysostom. So quite often, if you Google Adversos Judaeos, you'll be taken to his particular work that is entitled Adversos Judaeos, but it's also a title that has been given to a body of writing, a collection of literature written by the Church Fathers against the Jews, Adversos Judaeos. So basically what we did last week is we pretty well focused our attention on that particular literature. And what I really tried to show you is that the Church Fathers essentially laid if you can call it that, but for want of a better term, laid the theological foundations of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism within the church. So that's essentially the focus of what was last week's session. Now, moving on, today we are actually going to move from theology to practice. In other words, we're going to move from the theory to the way the theory was put actually into practice. We're going to move from anti-Jewish theology, the foundations that were laid by the Church Fathers, to actually anti-Jewish law. And we're going to, in the background, we're going to be sort of pretty well focusing on the first 6 or 7 centuries of Jews under Christian rule. And next week, we will continue that narrative moving beyond the 11th century. So that's our focus pretty much today. So let's begin. and we'll start with the very, very important event in the history of the Roman Empire, and indeed in the history of Christianity itself, and that is the coming to power of Constantine the Great. Sure that all of you have heard of him. You may not know a lot about what he did, but Constantine the Great is a seminal figure in the history of the Roman Empire and of the Church as well. Now, amongst other things that he did in the year of 313 is that he issued an edict called the Edict of Milan. And what that essentially did is that it granted, if you want, almost religious toleration to the various religions within the Roman Empire. Now, you have to understand that Judaism itself had already for quite a long time, certainly for a century, had an elevated status. Jews and Judaism in the Roman Empire. So about a century before, Jews had already acquired citizenship within the Roman Empire, whilst what you actually find is that Christianity and Christians were in an inferior position. In fact, for a period of time, Christianity was declared an illegal religion. And indeed, we know that for a period of time under a number of emperors, Christians were in fact persecuted within the Roman Empire as well. But in 313, all that came to an end. Various religions were declared, where religious toleration was accepted. But more important than that is that Constantine himself became what was effectively a patron of the Christian faith. Now, people often think of, Constantine as having converted to Christianity, which he did, but there's some doubt as to whether this actually happened during the greater part of his reign. We know that it would appear that on his deathbed, he did accept Christianity as a faith, but it may have been earlier as well. But whatever the case may be, he was a patron of the Christian faith. Now, there's, when it comes to explaining these sorts of questions, particularly in the context of ancient history, there's always the legend, and there's always what might be more plausible historical reality. And there is a story told that on the night before Constantine was going to enter into a very important battle, he actually had a dream, and his sword basically sort of changed into a crucifix. And on the basis of that dream, he became a Christian himself. Now, whether that story is true or not is by the by, but I think a more realistic explanation is that one of the things that Constantine realized by the time he came to power is that Christianity had really, really become a major, major phenomenon within the Roman world. And, it gets to a point where you say, if you can't beat them, you might as well join them. And one advantage of that is that by joining them, you can actually influence the direction of this particular phenomenon. And that's essentially what Constantine did. And Christianity, from going from becoming a persecuted religion, not only became a religion that was now legal, but in fact acquired a favored position within the Roman Empire as well. But our discussion is not on the history of the church. Our discussion is more on the relationship between Christianity and Judaism and the Jewish people. So the question, of course, is what is the relationship that augured for his relationship to the Jews? And in essence, what we have is the beginning, as you can see here, of a long and even continuing process in which anti-Jewish theology, which is what we focused on last week, actually becomes translated into anti-Jewish legislation. And I want to give you just a couple of examples of things that happened in the lifetime of Constantine himself. So, for example, in the year of 329, amongst a number of other pieces of anti-Jewish legislation, one of the things that was banned was Jewish missionary activity. Now, this might come as a surprise to some people, because some people might say, well, I thought Judaism was not a missionary faith, a missionary religion. That certainly is the case today. Jews don't go out and actively proselytize. as is the case in certain branches of Christianity. And that certainly is the case today. But there was a time when Judaism and Jews were in fact open to accepting converts to their faith. Now, the question of whether they actively went out and proselytized is a contested question. But one thing that we do know is that they were very, very open to accepting converts into the faith. You remember, we're talking about a pagan world. We're not talking about people who were already monotheists of one sort or another. So they were open to sort of bringing the light of their monotheistic belief to the pagan world. So they were open to that. But what it meant, of course, is that for a long, long time, even before this period of history, there was intense competition between Jews and Christians for getting converts into their particular faith. You remember that really the commissioning of the disciples of Jesus, when he brings them together after his resurrection, the commissioning is go out and spread the good news, go out and spread the gospel. And we certainly know that when Paul came onto the scene, he became sort of very, very heavily involved in spreading the good news, the gospel, to the various parts of the Roman Empire, what was also the Jewish diaspora. So there was very, very intense competition. And so when Constantine comes to power, he puts that to an end. And really on the threat of death, it wasn't simply saying you were not allowed to, missionary activity was banned. And that in large measure is one of the main reasons as to why Jews stopped proselytizing. Jews have always been a very practical people. Whilst they might be open to accepting converts, if it was at the threat of death, they thought, well, you know, it's not really all that important. And so over a period of time, missionary activity faded into the background. And by the way, when Islam comes onto the scene, Islam issues a similar directive against Christians and Jews under its rule. And they're not allowed to proselytize within the Islamic world either. That's one example. The other example is 325, when a very important council was brought together by Constantine called the Council of Nicaea. Now, Christians will hear a ring of familiarity in that word Nicaea, because that is where the Nicene Creed, a creed that is still recited in the church today, was actually established. But one of the interesting things that happened at the Council of Nicaea is that there was a formal separation made between Easter and Passover. I think, as all of you know, Easter and Passover are celebrated more or less at the same time, but not at an identical time, which once was the case. So, for example, this edict was issued at the Council of Nicaea, and it said it was declared to be particularly unworthy for the holiest of all festivals, that is Easter, of course, to follow the custom, in other words, the calculation, the calendrical calculation of the Jews, who had soiled their hands with the most fearful of crimes and whose minds were blinded, of course, to the truth of Christianity. We ought not, therefore, to have anything in common with the Jews, for the Saviour has shown us another way. Our worship follows a more legitimate and more convenient course. How can they be in the right, they who, after the death of the Saviour, have no longer been led by reason, but by wild violence, as their delusion may urge them? We would not imitate those who are openly in error. How then can we follow these Jews who are most certainly blinded by error? Now, importantly, what you have here is a sort of a combination and intertwining of the anti-Jewish theology, or the adversos Judaeos language of the church fathers, combined with legal language as well. So a certain law is being passed which separates the calculation of the date for the celebration of Easter from Passover. But notice the idea of the deicide crime, they who have committed this great crime, whose minds are blinded to the truth of Christianity. How can they be in the right after the death of the Saviour? Now, when you read that, what you're hearing are in fact echoes of the church fathers themselves. So you can see very, very clearly, and this is only one of many, many examples. When you look at a lot of this anti-Jewish legislation, you will actually see adversos Judaeos type of language coming in to the fore as well. So that's just one particular example. Now, if we go to Constantine's successors, if we go, for example, to Constantius, I think it was his grandson, or his great-grandson, but whatever it was, for example, he places a ban on intermarriage between Jews and women in the weaving factories. Now, why specifically the weaving factories? It's not clear, but it would seem that Jews and women in the weaving factories were intermarrying, and they issued a ban on this. And it said this prohibition is to be preserved for the future, lest the Jews induce Christian women to share their shameful lives. If they do this, they will subject themselves to a death sentence. Now, notice what's implied here is the ban on missionary activity, because there was a concern, of course, that, when a man would marry a Christian woman, in all probability, in all likelihood, she would adopt the faith of her husband. And remember, we've already seen a ban being placed on missionizing, on proselytizing. And so this is sort of carried through in this ban on intermarriage. But the fear is that they will somehow take on the shameful lives of their Jewish husbands. And in a similar vein, in that particular year, there was a prohibition of Jewish ownership of slaves. Now, I'm not going to get into the morality of whether it was good or bad or whatever to own slaves. That was a reality. People owned slaves at the time, but there was a prohibition placed on the Jewish ownership of slaves. And here we read that if anyone amongst the Jews has purchased a slave of another sect or nation, that slave shall be appropriated for the imperial treasury. And if indeed he shall have circumcised that slave who had purchased, he will not only be fined for the damage done to that slave, but he will also receive capital punishment. Now, what's interesting, of course, is damage done to the slave. You get an idea here that slaves were, of course, regarded as personal property. So the damage to the slave is damage to the property of the slave owner. That's just by the by. But again, notice there is a fear that the slave would be converted to the faith of Judaism, because that's the only reason you would circumcise the slave, to actually convert him. And notice again, it's this incredible fear at this early stage in the development of Christianity, that there was always going to be fear that Jews would somehow be more successful in bringing pagans over to their cause. And not only pagans, but also influencing Christians to come over to their cause. You have to remember that the church at this point is in a very, very early stage of development. It's a nascent church. It's a church that is only really beginning to emerge. So therefore, there was this deep fear that Jews would somehow influence others to come over to their religion. Which brings us now to Theodosius I, who was in the line of Constantine. And one of the things that he did, and this is a very important moment, and not to be confused with Constantine himself, because people often say that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That is not the case. That actually happened in the year of 380 under Theodosius, where he made Catholic Christianity, Catholic meaning universal. So Christianity becomes the universal religion of the Roman Empire, the official religion. But also, very importantly, he is the last emperor to rule over a unified empire. You've got to remember that the empire was vast. It stretched across the east and the west, and he was the last emperor to rule over a unified empire. And in the year of 395, in fact, it was the year in which he died as well, there was a permanent division of the empire between east and west, a permanent division. That would never change again. There would not be a moment, well, perhaps for a small period of time, but we don't have to go into that. But pretty much we now have the permanent division of the empire into east and west. And what you actually have, of course, is you have the Byzantine Empire, which is based in Constantinople, and that is the Eastern Church. And you have the Western Empire, which of course is based in Italy. I deliberately say Italy because it wasn't always Rome. It was sometimes Rome, it was sometimes Milan, it was sometimes a place called Ravenna, which is in the north eastern part of Italy. But you have an Eastern and Western empire, and by virtue of that fact, the stories of the Jews in their relationship with Christians become separate narratives. There is the story of Jews under Byzantine rule, and there is the story of Jews in Western Christendom. And our focus in this course is going to be on the Jews of Western Christendom. I don't even have the time to stop for a few minutes to say, very, very briefly, this is the story of what happened with the Jews in the eastern part of the Christian world. We're going to focus on Western Christendom. That will be very much our focus. So let us move on. So when we talk about the Jews of Western Christendom, before I even go into that, let me just describe for you the historical backdrop, because I'm going to be, in the course of my presentation, referencing a number of points from general history. And unless I just mention these and talk a little bit about them, they might make very little sense. So I want to just give you a little bit of historical context for the backdrop of what I'm going to be talking about further on in this presentation. So the first thing to keep in mind is that in the late 4th to the mid 5th centuries, we have a number of barbarian incursions into the Western Roman Empire. And that map at the top gives you a very, very clear sense. I mean, if you see Rome in the center, the heartland of the Western Roman Empire, you can see invasions and incursions from really what were the various parts of Northern Europe, but also other parts of the world, these barbarian groups infiltrating and making incursions into the Western Roman Empire. By the way, this did not begin in the 4th century. Barbarian incursions already go back to the 1st or 2nd century, but our focus is very, very much on this particular period when there's large numbers, in fact, began to make these particular incursions into the Roman Empire. And not all that long after, in the year of 476, you actually have the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This is really the end of that Western half of the empire. And by the way, the Eastern Empire will continue to survive for about another 1,000 years. In about 1,000 years or so, the Eastern Empire, of course, will fall with the fall of Constantinople under the Ottomans. But that's a long way off, and that's the Eastern Empire. Our focus is very much on the Western Empire. And what you have in place of a unified Western Empire, because you've had these various barbarian groups infiltrating the Western Empire, what you actually have is the rise of barbarian kingdoms, right, in their place. No longer is it a unified empire, but barbarian kingdoms. So just let me go back again a minute, and what you can see is that map below. Instead of a unified empire, you get the kingdom of the Franks, you get the kingdom of the Visigoths, you get the Saxons and Vandals and so on and so on and so on. And notice, of course, down here, you actually have a unified Byzantine Empire. So the Eastern Church operates under a unified empire, whereas Western Christendom is split up now into individual barbarian kingdoms. Now, in the midst of all of that, what you will actually see is amongst these various individual kingdoms, the largest and the most prominent one that will come to power is the kingdom of the Franks. And you can actually see the transformation of the map from a large collection of smaller kingdoms. The Frankish Empire will actually swallow up a lot of these other kingdoms, and it will become the dominant one. And a very, very important moment in the history of the Frankish kingdom is the conversion of the Frankish ruler called Clovis. When I talk about conversion, he actually converts to Catholic Christianity. One of the things that we know about many of the barbarian rulers, barbarian kingdoms, is that had already adopted Christianity, but a form of Christianity known as Arian Christianity. And Arian Christianity was regarded as a heresy within the church. Basically, it was regarded as heretical because Arian Christianity, to put it in the most simplistic of terms, rejected the divinity of the Son. Remember the Holy Trinity, God, Father, and Son. They did not reject so much the concept of Trinity itself, but the divinity of Jesus. And that was regarded as a heresy within the mainstream church. In fact, at the Council of Nicaea that I spoke about earlier, Arian Christianity was actually declared to be a heresy within the church. So Clovis, the Franks had already embraced Arian Christianity, he converted to Catholicism. And that becomes a very, very important moment in the history of the church. Now, when you talk about the Kingdom of the Franks, there were a number of different ruling families. Like the earlier family were called the Merovingians. There was a Merovingian dynastic family, but the family that rises to the top is the Carolingian dynasty. You might have heard of Charlemagne, right? So Charlemagne was one of the most prominent figures within the Carolingian dynasty. And what actually happens in the year of 800 is that the then Pope, Leo III, actually made Charlemagne the Roman emperor. Now, if you think about this, it's a very important symbolic development, because what the Pope really wanted to try and do was to somehow, symbolically at least, go back to the great old days of the Roman Empire, which had now disappeared. And by crowning him Roman Empire, he was somehow trying to go back to that ancient ideal of a restored empire. But what it also ushered in, and this is very important, was an interdependent relationship between papacy and secular rulers. By virtue of the fact that the Pope had actually crowned Charlemagne emperor, and the evidence would seem to suggest that Charlemagne was very happy to be crowned emperor, but was not so happy about having to go to Rome to actually have this done, because he actually had to kneel in front of the Pope, and it was a symbolic act of submission to the papacy. And of course, Charlemagne was the ruler of a huge empire, and there was this beginning of a love-hate relationship, if you want, between secular rulers and papacy. There was always going to be a tussle, if you want, for power as to who would sit at the top and who would sort of be the subservient element in that relationship. And much of the history of the church in the Middle Ages is dominated by this sort of ongoing tension between papacy and individual secular rulers. But anyway, that gives you a little bit of the historical backdrop to the period that we are talking about. So I now want to turn my attention to the Jews of Western Christendom. And I want to begin by saying something about their legal status, because you've got to remember that they are now subjects of a world where Christianity is no longer just a religion, but Christianity now rules. We're now talking about Christendom, the kingdom of Christianity. So it's a whole different relationship. And one of the things that we find, the term that we the shorthand term that we use for Jewish legal status in Western Christendom is Christian Jewry law. In other words, there was Christian law as it applied to the Jews. Now, Jews were, in fact, as you can see here, subject to various systems of Jewry law, which also developed over time and also reflected the Jews' changing historical, political, and economic circumstances. So actually studying Jewish legal history in the context of Western Christendom is a very, very complex phenomenon, because it comes from many, many different sources. It's constantly changing depending on the circumstances. So it's not a straightforward thing. By the way, just as a footnote, the legal status of Jews in the Byzantine Christian world was very straightforward. Because in the Byzantine world, you didn't have a separation of church and state. In other words, the Byzantine emperor was also the titular head of the church. I say titular because the person who ran the church on a day-to-day basis was a man called the patriarch of the church, but the titular head was emperor, and he was also secular ruler. So there was no complexity about legal status. The law of the church was the law of the empire. But when it comes to Christendom, it's a very different story. So we begin on the first hand with what's called Christian Roman Jewry law. And in order to understand this, we have to go back to some earlier Roman emperors. They were Christian Roman emperors, but they were nevertheless Roman emperors. And there were two very important emperors. One was Theodosius II and Justinian I. Now, the reason why they are so important is that they were responsible for the development of two of the major, most important legal codes of the Roman world, what was called the Theodosian Code and the Justinian Code. In fact, when in particularly in the United States. It's not so much here in Australia, but in the United States, at sort of like really, really top schools of law. When you study the Western legal system, you are also introduced to the bedrock of that system, and you will actually study the Theodosian and the Justinian codes, because they actually fed into the development of what today becomes a system of Western law. Now, the important thing is this. Of the two codes, the Justinian code was virtually unknown in the West, which is what we're focusing on, until the end of the 11th century. And actually, the Justinian code, certainly as far as Jews were concerned, was much harsher in its treatment of Jews than was the Theodosian code. So the more moderate Theodosian code that lingered in the memories of European jurists and churchmen in the early Middle Ages. When I talk about early Middle Ages, I'm talking up until about the 11th century. And from the 11th century on, it's the Justinian code that also comes into play as well, but that's also a harsher code as well. Now, in the code of Theodosius, the Codex Theodosianus, this is important. We see the beginnings of a process, to quote from Edward Flannery, where ecclesiastical, that is church, and imperial legislation, the law of the empire concerning Judaism, would reflect one another faithfully. And that makes sense, because you've got to understand is that the emperors had become Christian emperors. They had embraced Catholic Christianity. And once they embrace Catholic Christianity, they also embrace the adversus Judaeus tradition of the church. So as emperors, they're also embracing a whole anti-Jewish tradition. And what you actually find in the Theodosian code in particular, and this is very important, restriction and discrimination were actually coupled with toleration. That's very, very important to understand. It was not just a history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Enmeshed within that history of anti-Judaism was also an element of toleration as well. Now, the question that we need to ask, and I'll come back to this a little bit later and we'll deal with it, but I'm going to give you a sort of an example of this. If we go to the Theodosian code, Codex Theodosianus, we have a particular law that was passed in 439 concerning Jews, Samaritans, heretics, and pagans. And this is what it says. It says, in order that these dangerous sects, and dangerous sects would have included Jews here, of course, which are mindful of our times, may not spread into life the more freely in indiscriminate disorder, as it were, we ordain by this law to be valid for all time the following. No Jew shall obtain office and dignities. To no Jew shall the administration of city service be permitted, nor shall anyone exercise the office of a defender, that is, an overseer of the city. Indeed, we believe it sinful that the enemies of the heavenly majesty and of the Roman laws should become the executors of our laws. Now, this is a piece of anti-Jewish legislation, but what you have to also appreciate is embedded within this was an important element of anti-Jewish Christian theology, because an important foundation stone of anti-Jewish Christian theology was the idea of the perpetual subservience of the Jews. Because the whole idea is that Christianity was meant to be the dominant faith. You remember, if we take the story of Cain and Abel, Cain was subjected to a life of wandering upon the face of the earth. Remember how Augustine read that particular story? I talked about it last week. So if indeed Jews were meant to be in a subservient relationship, you could not have them being rulers over Christians. And that's the theological rationale behind this anti-Jewish law. Then it goes on and says, moreover, we forbid that any new synagogue shall rise as a new building. And of course, I just add my own comment here that fewer synagogues meant that there was less of a chance of Christians becoming Jews, because Judaism still held a certain fascination for Christians at this early period. However, even though you could not build a new synagogue, it goes on and says the propping up of old synagogues, which are now threatened with imminent ruin, is permitted. Now, to these things we also add that he who misleads a slave or a freeman against his will, in other words, tries to convert him to Judaism, or by punishable advice from the service of the Christian religion to that of an abominable sect and ritual, is to be punished by loss of property and life. Notice once again, it's the ever-present fear of the idea that Jews will somehow be able to influence Christians and even pagans to the faith of Judaism itself. So you can see that there's almost a sort of paranoid obsession with the idea that Jews will continue to influence Christians as well. So that's the side of discrimination. But you remember I talked about toleration as well. At the same time that we have anti-Jewish law, it goes on and says, it is sufficiently established that the sect of the Jews is forbidden by no law at all. In other words, it makes the point that Judaism continues to be a legal religion, what they refer to in Latin as religio licita, a licit religion, a legal religion. And for example, by law, it stated that Christians were not allowed to interfere with the Jewish observance of the Sabbath. The assembly of Jews for worship was permitted as a matter of right. Jews were protected by law against wanton assault on their persons, their property, and including the protection of synagogues. So that's important to understand, that at the same time as you have the stick, you also have the carrot as well. It's discrimination, even oppression, and persecution, you could say, coupled with toleration as well. So that's one body of law, the law of the Roman emperors, who have now become Christian Roman emperors as well. You've also got canon jury law, and canon jury law is a broad term that refers to the law of the church, because the church, you remember, we have a separation of church and state here. So you've got the law of the empire and you've got the law of the church itself. So you have, for example, relevant sections of the Theodosian Code, because when you remember I said you have the beginnings of a relationship between church and empire. So, you know, what happened is that when the church became an established institution, it took on certain sections of the Theodosian Code which were both anti-Jewish and also tolerant as well. So it absorbed that tradition as well. On top of that, you have edicts of church councils, because every once in a while, the church would come together to discuss business. And always, at every church council, one of the items on the agenda was, what about the Jews, right? That always part of the business of the church council. So you have various edicts coming out. You also have declarations and letters written by popes. And they also had various policies regarding the Jews. And one of the points that Mark Cohen makes is that he says nearly all of the canons, all of the laws, if you want, of diocesan and ecumenical church councils regarding the Jews, whether it was in Spain, whether it was in Gaul, where the Franks ruled, or whether it was in the East even, most of those laws relating to the Jews tended to be repressive and tended to reflect the intolerant streak of Christianity, right? So on the whole, they were not very, very favorably inclined towards Jews. Now, let us move for a minute towards the papal attitudes towards Jews, because what I've just spoken about in the previous point was church councils. When they came together, almost invariably, the edicts that came out of these church councils tended on the whole to be anti-Jewish edicts, right? Let's talk a little bit about the papal attitudes, because you're probably thinking, well, why am I distinguishing this? Surely whatever was issued at a church council, wouldn't that have necessarily been the attitude of the papacy towards the Jews as well? And here we are in for an element of surprise. So let us go to Pope Gregory I, and I'm jumping in the history of the papacy. When we come to Pope Gregory I, we're coming to the end of the 6th century. In Christian tradition, the first pope was Peter. So we're going back a long time in the history of the church. But I'm jumping forward 6 centuries to Pope Gregory I. I'm jumping to him because probably he's regarded as one of the greatest popes in the history of the papacy itself. He was what we would describe as a great reforming pope. And when we talk about Christianity becoming Christendom, really a power in its own right, not just a religion, that in large measure was due to many of the reforms that Gregory introduced into the church. So he is very, very important. Now, when it comes to the Jews, he made the following statement. He says, just as it should not be permitted to the Jews to presume to do in their synagogues anything other than that is permitted to them by law, so with regard to those things which have been conceded to them, they ought to suffer no injury. Now, this is typical legal language. You know, whenever you read a contract, you think, why can't they say it in simple English? And what this is basically saying, it's acknowledging, if I go to the end of that statement, it's acknowledging that Jews have been given certain rights, right? Jews have been given certain rights, and those rights have been given to them all the way back to the Roman emperors. Christian Roman emperors have given them certain rights. And he says, those rights we cannot take away from them. Those things which have been conceded to them, they ought to suffer no injury. We are not going to take away that which has been given to the Jews. But just in case these Jews should start feeling a little bit uppity and just feeling for a minute that they can do more than the law has given them and has allowed to them, they should not presume to do in their synagogues other than what the law allows them to do. And that statement, just as not Jews, is the Latin phrase sicut Judaeus non. Very important phrase to remember, because what you're actually going to see in subsequent declarations by the Pope, you're going to see that phrase used time and time again. The Jews ought to suffer no prejudice. Sicut Judaeus non. I'm not going to read this with you because we're going to come to it later on. But in the year of 1120, this is very important. It was just after the First Crusade. And in the First Crusade, Jewish communities in Germany in particular were entirely massacred by crusading armies. And in the aftermath of that particular event, harking back to Pope Gregory I, where Jews ought to suffer no injury for those things which the law has given them, the Pope actually issued, they ought to suffer no prejudice. And look, he says, with the meekness of our Christian piety, in the footprints of our predecessors, and he names various popes, Calixtus, etc., we grant them the protection of the buckler of our protection. Buckler is a fancy word for shield. So notice, very importantly, the papacy is coming forward and protecting the subjects of the Christian world at that time. And when you hear that, you are hearing the words of Pope Gregory's declaration, sicut Judaeus non, right? And people are often surprised by this because they think, you know, if anyone is going to be harsh in their attitude towards Jews, it's certainly going to be the papacy as the arch representative of the Catholic Church. So you have this mixture of anti-Jewish legislation on the part of the papacy, but also a protective element as well. And where does this come from? How do you explain this? Well, firstly, there's Paul himself. So if you go to the his letter to the Romans, Paul says this in the letter. He says, let me pose a further question. Is it possible that God has rejected his people? He's referring to the Jews, of course. He says, of course not. He says, I myself, says Paul, an Israelite, says, and not only an Israelite, but I'm descended from Abraham through the time, could never agree that God had rejected his people, the people he chose specially long ago. Now, if Paul himself is basically saying that the Jewish people continue to be the chosen people of God, the papacy could not simply pretend that that was no longer the case. And that is reflected, therefore, in their protective attitude towards the Jews, Pauline theology. But there's also another way of explaining it. And he says the Jews are enemies of God only with regard to the good news, and enemies only for your sake. But as the chosen people, they're still loved by him, and they're loved for the sake of their ancestors. God never takes back his gifts or revokes his choice. So therefore, in terms of papal policy, they are guaranteed protection because of that. But there's also Augustine. Remember we talked about last week that concept of the Jews as witness. Even though the Jews are to suffer humiliation and discrimination because of their killing of Christ, at the same time, Augustine says, not by bodily death shall the ungodly race of the Jews perish. And he's now saying this to Christian rulers. He says, whoever destroys them in this way, whoever harms them, in other words, shall suffer a sevenfold vengeance. In other words, bring upon himself the sevenfold penalty under the which the Jews lie for the crucifixion of Christ. He's referring here to the story of Cain and Abel. So if you were with me last week, that should resonate. I'm not going to repeat it now. So he goes on and says, to the end of the 7 days of time, look at this, the continued preservation of the Jews will be a proof to believing Christians of the subjection merited by those who in the pride of their kingdom put the Lord to death. But he also says, no emperor or monarch who finds under his government the people with this mark can kill them. That is, make them cease to be Jews, and as Jews to be separate in their observance and unlike the rest of the world. So very, very importantly, what you have to understand is Augustinian theology became the foundation stone of papal policy regarding the Jews. So whenever you hear popes declaring sicut Judaeus non, declaring that principle of protection of Jews that you hear with Pope Gregory I, you're basically having an echo of the theology of Augustine himself. However, what you have to understand, and this is really foreshadowing our session next week, even though there is a policy of papal protection in place, Mark Cohen basically says the papal guarantee of protection to the Jews increasingly became attenuated. In other words, it became weaker in the 13th century, and it was replaced increasingly by an attitude of hostility and a strong desire to exclude the infidel Jews from the company of Christians. Now, I'm going to expand on this in a lot more detail next week, but it is important to understand that we are dealing here with the period from the 4th to the 11th centuries. So up until the 11th century, you might sort of say that the protective side of papal policy was stronger than the more discriminatory side of papal policy, because there were two elements to it. But from about the 13th century on, the more discriminatory side will become the stronger and the more dominant one. Now, in addition to the law of the church, in addition to the law of the emperors, you remember that the empire disappeared at the end of the 5th century, and it was replaced by individual barbarian kingdoms. We're no longer talking about a single empire. The Western Empire has disappeared, and it's been replaced by individual barbarian kingdoms. So when Jews now come under the rule of individual barbarian rulers, interestingly, initially at least, they were still seen as Roman citizens, which they were. And they were subject to the law of the Roman Empire. So a lot did not change in the early period of that thing. But you have to also understand that the barbarian rulers had their own particular models of Roman law. So when they basically took over the Western Empire, they actually had a great deal of respect for Roman civilization. And they absorbed many elements of Roman civilization, including the Roman legal system. But what they did is they adapted that. And you have what you call barbarian models of Roman law. And elements of those barbarian models of Roman law also contained elements of Jewry law. There were certain laws regarding and relating to the Jews as well. So, for example, you have a body of barbarian law called the Lex Romana Visigothorum, and you can see very clearly that this refers to the Visigoths. So there was a legal code that the Visigoths developed, but look, it is the Lex Romana of the Visigoths. It's the Roman law of the Visigoths that they had actually absorbed into their own body of law. and that was developed in 506. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at the Visigothic code and its relationship to the Jews, Mark Cohen makes the following point. He says the Breviary of Alaric, the Visigothic code, reflects the tone of the Theodosian code. And the Theodosian code is more tolerant. Remember, I talked about the Justinian code being a lot more harsh. We'll talk about that next week. The Theodosian code was more tolerant. So the Visigothic code reflected the tone of the Theodosian code, as well as a tendency towards tolerance regarding the Jews that was characteristic of Arian Christianity, something that the Visigoths professed, at least at the outset of their Christianization. They became Catholics later on, but at the outset, they were Arian Christians. Arian Christians tended to be more tolerant towards Jews than were Catholic Christians. Remember, I said to you, one of the characteristics of Arian Christianity was rejecting the divinity of the Son. Now, if you reject the divinity of the Son, you cannot kill God by definition. You with me? If the Son is not God, by definition, there is no deicide. You cannot kill God because that element of the Godhead, which is the Son, is not divine. And therefore, because the element of Christianity was of deicide was it was absent in Arian Christianity, that tended to be somewhat more tolerant. But it's going to change, of course, once the Visigoths convert to Christianity. Then they will absorb that harsher element of anti-Jewish law. And that's what I say here. When the Visigoths converted to Christianity in the early 6th century, the Visigoths, by the way, were the dominant rulers in Spain. What you actually see is, from a quite protective policy under the Visigoths as Arian Christians, when they converted to Catholicism, Spain was one of the most vicious anti-Jewish countries in the Christian world at that time. You know, there's nothing like a born again. You know, the zeal of a sort of a born again, recently converted to Catholicism, Arian Christian. They really reflected this zeal in their persecution of Jews. So it was a very, very bad time for Jews under their conversion. And as you can see here, the law, there was a new legal code that came into the 7th century, and we read here that the protection that the Jews had enjoyed by virtue of their Roman citizenship actually now disappeared. So once the Visigoths converted to Catholicism, they no longer really regarded themselves as sort of part of this old Roman Empire, but they were now Catholic Christians, and all of the provisions in the new Visigothic code were restrictive and intolerant in the extreme. So things got really, really quite bad when you get the conversion of the Visigoths to Catholic Christianity. Now let's come to the Franks, because you remember in my historical introduction, I said that the group that became the dominant power group in what today is Western Central Europe, because if you just think back to that little map that I showed you of the extent of the Frankish Empire, if you actually superimpose that on a map of modern Europe, it actually takes up a good part of the Western and Central Europe today. So let's talk a little bit about the legal status of Jews under the Franks, which were really the dominant barbarian group at the time. Well, firstly, what they did is they adopted the Visigothic code. They actually adopted the in certain parts of southern and eastern France that were conquered by the Franks. They actually adopted part of that Visigothic code. But in northern France and in Germany, really today what is pretty much Western Central Europe, Cohen says the following: there, the Franks applied barbarian customary law with its principle of the personality of the law. In other words, the idea that the law for an individual depended on the tribal group to which that person belonged, rather than on the region in which he actually lived. So what you actually start to see happening under Frankish law is that the Franks are actually going Okay, sorry about that. So thank you, Anita. I'm gonna depend on you to give me a wave if this happens again. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I
Right.
can hear you. Yes. Thank you, Anita. I was thinking it was my headphones that had failed and I was just taking them out. So I appreciate
No,
that.
no. Anita is going to keep us all honest here this morning.
All right.
So, okay. So let me continue with where I had left off. And so what you then have is that the Jews are treated as a distinct tribal element within the Frankish kingdom. So what you actually see, interestingly, is that when it comes to the Carolingian dynasty, remember I talked about the dynasty of Charlemagne, when it comes to Jews under Carolingian rule, what you actually see happening is that they are subjected to a number of royal charters. There were special charters that was developed by the Carolingian rulers that applied specifically to the Jews. And one of the defining characteristics of these particular charters is that on the whole, they were very, very protective. They were very protective. So the person who really stands out here is Louis the Pious. Now, Louis the Pious was the son of Charlemagne. He was the successor to Charlemagne. And what happened in the reign of Louis the Pious is you really have, under his rule in particular, you really have the development of these royal charters that were extended to the Jews. And really what you have to appreciate is that the royal charters were actually issued in the context of the Franks wanting to attract Jews into their kingdom. Now, why did they want to attract Jews into their kingdom? Because they saw that there were certain benefits to attract Jews into a kingdom that really wanted to become, it wanted to really develop its economy. Because you've got to remember that the world at that time was highly ruralized. When the barbarians basically brought the Roman Empire to an end, what was a highly urban society became a predominantly rural society. And a lot of the elements of Roman civilization quite literally disappeared. We know that roads and bridges and infrastructure just fell into disrepair. So really, Europe reverted into what many people often talk about the Dark Ages. So when the Carolingians came to power, they wanted to emerge from those Dark Ages, and that they wanted to sort of try and move back towards a situation that had existed when the Roman Empire was at its height in the West. So one of the things that they wanted to do was, therefore, they wanted to attract Jews into their kingdom so that they could help them develop their economy and trade and so on and so on. So these charters tended to be very, very protective, and actually Jews were invited into the kingdom of the Franks. Now what happens, and this is my next point that I've just brought up here, is that these charters exemplify the beginning of a process. It's going to continue for many centuries, whereby Jews over time would come to belong, in the sense of almost absolute control, to a secular ruler, and thus to have a special but limiting status under the law. And really what you find is that in the countries of Northern Europe, these royal and imperial charters governing and protecting Jews evolved into direct, unmediated legal dependence on a central ruler. Now, what this marks is the beginnings of a development which will culminate during the first half of the centuries in Jews being called in law servi camerae regis. Now that translates in serfs of the royal chamber. And you know what a serf is? A serf is a peasant who actually belonged to a lord. So Jews, by the time you get to the 13th century, become the personal property of kings. And they are that because kings invite them into their kingdoms. They extend all sorts of rights and privileges to them. They want them there, and they want to protect them because there are many, many benefits to be gained by doing so. And they actually evolve into the status of becoming the personal property of the kings themselves. But that concept goes all the way back to Louis the Pious when he introduced these protective royal charters to his Jewish subjects. Now, on top of that body of law, you have another body of law that's called municipal law. The municipal law is basically the law of the towns, the law of the cities. Now, this is not so important now, but will become a lot more important during the pivotal 11th century. We're going to focus on that more next week. Remember, I just said to you briefly that before the 11th century, Europe, or the barbarian kingdoms, were highly ruralized. It was a very rural economy. But what's going to happen in the 11th century, and I'm just prefiguring what I'm going to talk about next week, is in the 11th century is going to be an economic revolution. And what we're going to see is Europe moving from a highly ruralized state into a highly urbanized state. And that's going to happen, it's going to start to happen during the 11th century. Now, obviously, when that happens, and towns and cities come to the fore, you're actually finding that Jews are going to become an important element in those towns and cities. And municipal law will also develop a series of laws regarding their status as well. But I'll talk more about that next week. But I want to make a sort of a summary statement at this point and talk about the relationship between church law and secular law. So remember, when we're talking about secular law, we're talking about the law of the barbarian kingdoms, we're talking about royal charters, we're talking about the law of the towns and the cities. So all of the law that existed outside of the framework of the church, what we might call secular law, it doesn't mean that the two were totally separated from each other. And Mark Cohen makes this particular point. He says, just as papal decrees and decrees of church councils had a direct, if a slow and uneven impact on the content and practice of secular law, so did canon law as well. In other words, the law of the church actually influenced the law of the state. As Guido Kisch points out in his study of medieval Germany, even if papal decrees and decrees of councils did not immediately influence the state's jury legislation, they nevertheless seriously affected the status of the Jews. Their social and economic position was adversely affected, and their life was made quite miserable. In other words, to just simplify this statement, because it has to be unpacked a little bit, and I don't have the time to do that. Basically, what Cohen is really saying is that as much as the law of the state tended to be protective of Jews, because it was the interests of rulers to do that, they could not help but also be influenced by the law of the church. And that will become a lot more evident next week when we talk about the period after the 11th century. Now, let me say something very, in fact, Ellen, just to give my voice a little bit of a break, let me stop at this point, because I finished with a big topic, that is the legal status of the Jews. And let me stop and see if people have any particular questions that they want me to answer regarding what I've just spoken about.
Absolutely. So early on in your presentation, just a little bit after 4, Anita was asking, what are some examples of their wild violence? So if you can think back to that part of your presentation.
Of their, which one? The wild?
Wild violence.
On whose part? On?
There is no qualification for that. So I apologize. It was early on in your presentation. Let's jump to Bob's question then, and maybe Anita can clarify for me exactly what she was thinking in the chat, and I can ask that one again. So Bob is asking, was there any realization among Christians, Jews, and monarchs that they were all praying to the same God? So monotheism.
Look, in a sense, Christians would have had to acknowledge, and we're not yet in the world of Islam. Islam will come later on, but certainly there's no question that Christians had to acknowledge that Jews, and certainly a lot later on, that they had to acknowledge that Jews and Muslims were a monotheistic people. But what you actually have in sort of Christendom is the idea that Jews had the wrong interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, Remember, Augustine was the one who said it is the Jews themselves, as the people of God, who are preserving the Hebrew scriptures. But their problem is that they are mistaken. They are blind to the truth of Christianity. So, Paul said they remain the chosen people of God, but they're the chosen people of God who are blind to the truth and the faith of Christianity. So there's this sort of double-edged element to their status.
Thank you. Susan then is asking, what portion of the Jews at the time of the Carolingians were living in Europe? And were most of the Jews at that time in the Near East until at least around 1000 Common Era?
Right. So that's a good question. So at about the time that we are talking about the reign of Louis the Pious, which is around about the early 9th century, firstly, the number of Jews in the western part of the empire was very, very small. So when we are talking about Western Christendom, before the 11th century, the numbers of Jews were tiny. They would have been scattered communities here and there. The vast number of Jews at that time were living in what today would be the Middle East, in different countries of the Middle East. And not long after, what would actually happen is that many of the Jews living in the Middle East would go to Spain, which came under Islamic rule. Because in the 8th century, Spain becomes a Muslim country. And large numbers of Jews move into the Islamic world of Spain. And at a certain point, the single largest Jewish population in the world is going to be living in Muslim Spain. So at this point, we're talking about a very, very, very small Jewish community. That will change after the 11th century, and we're going to talk about that next week.
Fantastic. And then what is the source of the word Carolingian?
Carolingian, Charles Carolus. Charles, Latin Carolus, Carolingian. So Charles was the founding daddy, if you want, the founding father of Carolingians, and it took from Carolus, Carolingians.
Thank you for clarifying that. The last question that we have is, Susan is curious about the movements of the diaspora of Jewry during this time period.
The diaspora.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we talk about the diaspora, I mean, as I said to you, when we talk about Jews living in different parts of the world at that time, I've already made the point that the dominant element lived firstly in what today is the Middle East, and then a huge population shift went to North Africa, by the way. So North Africa becomes Jews of Morocco become quite important, and Algiers and Tangiers and so on, but also Spain. So that's the dominant group. And in the western part of Europe, it's very, very small. Right? That's the thing.
All right.
Okay.
Fantastic. No more questions in the chat right now. So if you want to continue sharing your screen, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll do that. So let's talk a little bit about the place of the Jews in the feudal structure of Europe at the time. Now, even if you don't know a lot about it, everyone will remember the feudal system, right? When you went to school, they just hammered the feudal system into your head. I remember it was always, in my time, in grade 8. In the 8th grade is when you studied about the feudal. I think they still do today. Now, let's remember that the feudal system the feudal society was very hierarchical. You remember there was like a pyramid. You remember had the monarchy, you had the nobility, you had the church, you had the middle class, you had the peasants, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So it's very, very important to understand that when we talk about Jews in Western Christendom at this particular time, you have to sort of really ask the question, where did they fit in to the structure of feudal society? And I think what's quite important to appreciate when we ask that question, where they fitted in will become clear in a minute, because one of the things we have to understand is that even though European society at that time was highly ruralized, based very, very strongly on agriculture, Jews had by this particular time pretty much abandoned agricultural pursuits. Now, it's not necessarily because they were not allowed to own land. You remember I said to you much, much earlier in this presentation that they were prohibited from owning slaves. And I noticed that Anita's just nodded her head. She's connected some dots here, because what you actually see is that if you owned land, you had to have people to work that land. And if you were not allowed to own slaves, by definition, land ownership was going to become very, very problematic. So increasingly, Jews abandon agricultural pursuits. And as I said, church councils did not allow them to do that. And basically, not only that, but the feudal system itself prevented Jews from owning land, because the way in which the feudal system worked, the hierarchical system, is if you owned a piece of land, you were a landowner, let's say you were a nobleman, you actually got that land from the king. That's the whole point of the feudal system. The kings had these huge pieces of territory. They were unmanageable. So what they actually did is they broke up those pieces of land into what were called feuda, F-E-U-D-A, a Latin term. So large empires, large kingdoms were broken up. And let's say if I was a nobleman, I was given a piece of land that I could control. But in return for that piece of land, I had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. Now, swearing an oath of allegiance in those times meant swearing a Christian oath of allegiance. You had to swear an oath in the name of the Father, the Son. Now, Jews were prevented from doing that. So the system itself locked them out of land ownership, because the hierarchical nature, the oath-taking system, did not allow them basically to do that. But also it was the fact that they could not own slaves. So really what you actually find, if you look at this quote, is that by the late 8th century, agriculture was really a marginal Jewish occupation. And to the degree that they did engage in agriculture, they were basically wine growers, right? Yeah, grape growers and producing wine. Now, Leonard Glick makes this point. He says, occasionally, a Jew might be a landowner, but this meant nothing in the world of feudal relationships. Because although a Jew might be required to declare dutiful submission to a lord, he did not pledge military support, because you had to do so in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And certainly he would not receive homage under any circumstances, because homage required you to take a Christian oath. Thus, whatever role land played in the experience of a few Jews, it is to urban centers and to the world of commerce that we have to look for an understanding of Jewish life. So Jews are very, very much outside the rural structure of feudal society. They are town dwellers. And when we talk about the status of Jews in medieval towns, we're going to talk a lot more about that next week, because from the 11th century on, the towns are going to become a lot more prominent in medieval society. And that's when we'll have more to say about the structure of Jews in medieval towns. But basically what it comes down to is this, is Jews actually were a separate social unit in the structure of medieval society. They didn't fit into the feudal system. They didn't fit into, so basically, if you had a pyramid that defined Christian society in the feudal system, there was a separate pyramid for Jews outside of that system. I say a pyramid as well because Jews inside their own communities also had a sort of a hierarchical structure, but it was outside the structure of feudal society. So Jews were a separate social unit. So Leonard Glick goes on to say, living in the midst of a feudal social order that assigned all men to the categories of lords and knights and priests or serfs, Jews were in fact creating a social order that contrasted definitively with that of the larger society. So they were treated as an element unto themselves. They did not fit in to the established order of Christian society. To say something very quickly about the economic role of the Jews, because they were not really involved in rural pursuits. Remember, I've already spoken about the ruralization of Europe. Because Europe was so highly ruralized, Jews were pretty much kept out of that. And under the Carolingian Frankish rulers, you remember the Carolingian rulers issued these charters inviting Jews into their empire, the Jews basically became very, very much involved in trade and commerce. I mean, that's why they were invited in. Carolingians didn't need more farmers. There were plenty of them all around. What they needed were people of commerce, people of trade. So Jews became very, very much involved, particularly under the Carolingian rulers. And you remember the Frankish Empire was huge, took up most of what today is Western Central Europe, and Jews became the backbone of the commercial system of Christian Europe at the time. What you actually find is that basic foodstuffs were largely in Christian merchants' hands. That makes sense because, Christians controlled the land, and Christian merchants were basically the middlemen between the nobility and the farmers and so on. So foodstuffs were largely in thing, but the long distance trade and commerce was largely in Jewish hands. And let's remember that rulers would have greatly valued this because long distance trade was the sort of thing that would have brought oranges and spices, luxury goods, silk, all of that stuff into your society. So Jews were a highly, highly valued commodity, at least at the level of people like nobility and kings and so on. Very, very greatly valued the economic role of the Jews within society, Christian society at that particular time. And in fact, Jews had a virtual monopoly on the import and export trade. So they really were the economic backbone of the non-rural dimension of society. Now, it doesn't mean that all Jews were involved in trade and commerce. Many of them were involved in other economic pursuits. They were goldsmiths, they were tinsmiths, they produced cheese, they produced wine, all sorts of things, but they played a very, very important role in this long distance trade as well. Now, what's important, and this is really a segue into next week, is in the 11th century, Europe will be on the verge of a commercial revolution. Now, what I mean for that is that Europe will move from being an exclusively rural society to being a society, come here, Charlie, will be a society that is both rural. My dog needs a little bit of attention. I've been neglecting him for the last hour, so I'm just giving a bit of pat. So Europe is going to move from being an exclusively rural to also an increasingly urbanized society. And that revolution will impact very, very significantly on the status of the Jews. But that's more by way of a segue into next week. And this is where I really come towards the end of my presentation. And this is the segue into next week. And Mark Cohen makes this point. He says, for a few centuries in the early Middle Ages, in other words, up to the 11th century, Jews enjoyed a more or less, we don't get carried away here, but a more or less secure place in the natural hierarchical order of Christian society, as well as substantial economic rights. Now, that is a very, very important statement to remember, that when you talk about the development of Jewish-Christian relations, there is pre-11th century, post-11th century, right? Before and after. And the 11th century marks a turning point in Jewish-Christian relations. Up until the 11th century, they're more or less okay. The protective element of Christian theology, the protective element of papal policy, all of the things that I spoke about earlier, the protectors are more or less the dominant motifs of the Jewish relations, but of the relations between Jews and Christians. They're okay. It's not a garden of roses. It's not a bed of roses. Jews are still seen as the killers of Christ. They are still seen as a people who have to be subjected to humiliation and discrimination, but they are a people who also have to be protected as well. And from after the 11th century, that's going to completely change. I'm not going to read this with you, but in your own time, read this remarkable charter grant of land and privilege that was given to the Jews in 1084. which is in the late 11th century. And the only point I want to make here is who gives it. In the name of the Holy Indivisible Trinity, I, Rudiger, surnamed Hosmann, Bishop of Speyer, when I wanted to turn the village of Speyer into a town, I thought I would increase the honor of the place by bringing Jews into the town. Now notice, folks, this is the bishop, the leading churchman of this place, saying, by bringing Jews into the town of Speyer, I will be able to turn it into a village. No, I'll be, from making it a village, I'll be able to turn it into land, and the Jews will enhance the honor of this particular place. And in your own time, go on and read the provisions of this charter. The Jews are far, far more privileged in the village of Speyer than their Christian counterparts would be. It's a remarkable document because it just emphasizes the protective and privileged element of Jews in the imperial. And finally, have a quick look at this also. This is a record of a disputation of a Christian. Gilbert Crispin was a Christian churchman. And on a particular day, he says, I was having a sort of a debate, an argument with a Jew. And he says this, he says, I wrote it recently, putting to paper what a Jew said when formally disputing with me against our faith in defense of his own faith, what I replied in favor of the faith against his objections. So clearly, we don't know the circumstances, but clearly Crispin, who was a Christian churchman, had got together with a Jew and they were having like a big argument about which faith is the truer faith, Judaism or Christianity. He says, I don't know where this Jew was born, but he was educated at Mayence, which is in Germany. And look, he says he was well-versed even in our own law and literature, seemed to know something about Christianity, and he had a mind that was practiced in the scriptures and in disputes against us. He often used to come to me as a friend, both for business and to see me, since in certain things I was very necessary to him, and as often as we came together, we would soon get talking in a friendly spirit about the scriptures and about our faith. And now on a certain day, God granted both him and me greater leisure than usual, and soon we actually began questioning as usual. And his objections to my claims were consequent and logical. And has he explained with equal consequence his former objections, while our reply met his objections foot to foot, and by his own confession seemed equally supported by the testimony of the scriptures, some of the bystanders requested me to preserve our disputes as likely to be of use to others in our time. Now notice what is going on here. There is a spirit of amicability. He says, yes, we had arguments. We disagreed bitterly about our faith. He argued for his, but there was almost like a friendly debate. There was no element of animus. And the point that I'm trying to make is that the dispute of this record of a disputation with the Jew and the former grant of land privileges gives you a really indication of the point that I made, is that before the 11th century, Jews enjoyed a more or less secure place within the world of Christianity. So I'm going to stop there, Ellen. We have about 5 minutes left or so, 5 minutes, perhaps a few more for questions. So I'm happy to answer them and come back to you and stop my screen share.
Perfect. So we do have a couple questions. Georgette is asking, how are the Jews able to practice long distance trade? She understands that the later banking system would depend on geographical positions by exchanging money, but not material long distance trade.
Okay, great question. And one of the things you have to understand is you have to understand that Jews were part of a big diaspora. And there were Jews living in the Middle East. And the Middle East, of course, is the pathway to the Silk, to pathway to long distance trade. So when you were traveling, that's why people throughout history wanted so much to control the Middle East, because the Middle East was the gateway, right, to that thing. So Jews were part of a huge club, and the club was called the diaspora. They had connections all over the place. And that's how they were able to facilitate that. And by the way, another very important thing to keep in mind, at a time when Europe was ruralized, money disappeared. Because you remember, in a rural society, you don't need money.
Mhm.
Instead of money, they had what was called a barter system. If I had a particular skill, I could barter my skill in exchange for something else. You didn't
Mhm.
need money. So interestingly, Jews were the only people in a ruralized society who were accumulating large amounts of money. And this is very important, because when Christians are going to start moving into towns and cities, and they want to build cathedrals, and they want to establish businesses, what are they going to need? They're going to need money.
Mhm.
But the only people who've been accumulating this stuff are the Jews. And that's why Jews are going to become the hated money lenders. And we're going to talk about this next week. They're going to be a transition. Okay.
Fantastic. And the next question is, can you frame the time period for the ghetto in Venice with what you've talked about today?
Not even conceived of yet. It's not even in utero, right? There's not even a pregnant woman who is carrying a ghetto around inside her. This is going to come. This is really our discussion next week. In other words, next week, after the 11th century, things are going to go downhill. The theme of my lecture next week will be the low point of Jewish-Christian relations. I'm not going to go get carried away and say this period today was a high point, but relatively speaking, it was much better. We're going to see how things will deteriorate next week.
Thank you. And then Georgette is asking, and I apologize if I should know this answer, is the Disputation of Crispin available?
I believe so, but yeah, it is well, there's a translation of it, and I'd have to sort of do a little bit of homework, because I got this obviously from somewhere, but I'm not sure if I have the full document, or whether in the course of my doing research and Googling, it came up as an extract. But yes, it is available, definitely.
Fantastic. Yeah. And Anita is asking about other economic pursuits. Did that include lending money, charging interest? And is that what would precipitate the hatred at some point?
That's next week. In other words, when we talk about the economic pursuit of money lending, on top of the other things, that will happen next week. That's what we're going to talk about next week. So when I talk about the economic role of the Jews before the 11th century, money lending did not really figure in that. I mean, what did you need money for? If you were bartering, you didn't need money. But when you need money, you have to access it. And the only people who had it were Jews. And we'll talk about that next week.
And this might be a little bit off topic, but Bob is asking, when were the Jewish people allowed to be physicians?
Physicians?
Yes.
Well, and again, we'll pick that up a little bit next week. Look, the fact of the matter is that there was a law, and I think I'll talk about it next week. Later on in the Middle Ages, when Jews are allowed to be physicians, but are prevented from practicing medicine on Christians, right? And you'll understand why next week, because Christians started to develop this irrational fear of Jews. They actually believed that Jews could contaminate them, right? That's in the next part of our story. So they sort of said, you can be a doctor, but we don't want doctors practicing on Christians. So the popes, for example, and we know, for example, that often that law was ignored. It was ignored rather than observed. And many popes, for example, as much as Christian law said Jews could not practice on Christians, popes always loved Jewish doctors. Who doesn't, right? So, Jewish doctors were often much more favored by popes, even though law really technically meant they couldn't be. We actually know that there were doctors who actually served in papal courts, even though it was like they weren't meant to, all right?
Right. And we have time for, I think, one more question. And I think Alice's question your question, Anita, is rolled into Alice's question. So if you'll forgive me if I pick hers over yours. It seems as though each and every negative stereotype about the Jewish people has been created by Christian society. Do you think that that's a fair assessment?
Well, look, It is true, but we also have to understand that if we talk about the history of anti-Semitism did not begin with Christianity. In other words, there was a whole pagan world, and there was anti-Semitism in the pagan world as well. I would say that all of the stereotypes that we have about Jews are both pagan and Christian and Muslim, right? That's the thing. It's rolled into one. But that's a whole different story. That's the history of anti-Semitism, of which Christianity, of course, is a dominant player. There is no question. Certainly that whole notion of the Jews being involved with money and being mean, all of that stuff, the Shylock image, that very, very much comes on the back of the whole money lender sort of element. And we'll talk about that more next week. Okay.
I think we have the title for our next series, Paul.
Yeah.
We're starting to hash that out. I want to thank you again, Paul, for an excellent presentation. As Paul has mentioned, next Tuesday we will meet again for more insights. I'm sure it will be another compelling presentation. I also just dropped into the chat a link for tomorrow's special event. We have our in-house scholar, Avi Ben-Hur, who will be joining us. He is currently in Jerusalem, lives in Jerusalem, and he will be giving a special update on Israel. So we would love to see you tomorrow at the event. It is at 2 p.m. Eastern Time via Zoom. As always, our programs are free. To reach as many people as possible to support us, please visit our website to donate online. We hope you and your family stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you all again next week. Thank you, Paul.
There'll be another set of notes coming for you as well. So
absolutely. So Paul traditionally sends those to me on Sunday, so you get those traditionally on Monday and Tuesday. So if anybody would like them prior to that, just drop me an email. My email is ellen@cwbpgh.org, and I can send those off to you earlier.
Ellen just told you how I spend my weekends now. You see, that's getting ready for you folks. Anyway, okay, all the best.
True. All right, bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.